Story 1. This is the tale of how an entitled and borderline sociopathic classmate of mine had her academic life ruined before it had even started over some petty nonsense. Allow me to introduce her. I'll call her Karen Jr. Karen Jr. was a pretty decent student who made equally decent grades. Certainly nothing to scoff at. However, she didn't take any particularly hard classes, and it seemed as if she was merely skating in high school, waiting for the greater things in life. She was also a mythic witch. She had money and often flaunted it. She looked down on kids who didn't have as much as she did and was a classic case of spoiled jerk syndrome. She also had a habit of sending her mom on anyone who dared to rub her the wrong way. Let's talk about her. Her mom worked at the school as a math teacher and was very chummy with most of the other teachers, as well as the administration of both the school and the local county board. She was also a jerk. She would intentionally fail high-achieving students who might make her precious daughter look worse in the long run. We'll call this teacher Karen. As for myself, I was a senior in high school at the time of all of this, class of 2019. I am currently a college sophomore. In high school, I was one of the top students in the class. My undergraduate studies have been entirely paid for by academic scholarships, and I was one of a handful who were poised to be valedictorian for our class. Of course, this title did mean much to me. I worked very hard for scholarship money, not for some silly title. I'm saying this now not to brag, but because it's important to the story later. It's also important to note that this story takes place in the thick of college admission season. Seniors were scrambling to write essays, get important documents together, and raise standardized test scores before it was all said and done. I mostly only ever had class with Karen Jr. when I was taking courses required to graduate. These weren't hard classes at all and certainly were not weighted. Typically, my other classes would be advanced placement or dual credit courses to academically challenge myself and to raise my GPA for scholarships. I rarely had class with Karen Jr. in any of these courses, and the class size was so small for advanced placement at my school that if she had been, we would have been in the same class for sure. This was very odd, as she struck me as capable of handling the course load. That's when the crazy show began. You see, Karen Jr., like many other folks at this time, had also been trying to raise her test scores for college admissions. She claimed that she had anxiety, and as a result, she got some special accommodations whenever it was time to take tests, both for classes and standardized tests. However, she was notoriously extroverted in class discussions and never struck me as the nervous type. I have dealt with generalized anxiety disorder for years, and I wasn't buying it. I also didn't want to use this as a cop-out to get special privileges. But if that's what the psychologist note said, I didn't have an issue with it. For regular class tests, this meant that she got to leave the room and take her tests somewhere else. She typically went to the library, where she could take it in a more isolated setting. There was a rare situation where we did share a class, Advanced Placement United States Government. The teacher was also great friends with Karen. At my high school, it was known as one of the easier advanced placement classes, due to the heavy focus on vocabulary and the lack of challenging concepts. We had tests there on a 2-week basis, after covering the material in the textbook. I would study very hard for each and every test, and I always ended up with low A's. This was fine in my book since the other assignments would keep my grade above the 95 mark. As per usual, Karen Jr. would leave class every 2 weeks to take the test. That was all well and good, until she got a 100% on every single test. She's a capable student, but she's certainly no genius. She would also flaunt to her friends how she never studies for any of her tests because she just gets it. This continued for the first little bit of the course. Until one test day, the library was closed down after some water damage had been uncovered after a pretty bad storm. She couldn't take the test in the library as usual and had to take it with the rest of us. She seemed hesitant, but the teacher insisted that there was nowhere else suitable in the school for test taking. And so, she took the test and gloriously bombed it. I don't know exactly what she got, but she had shed a few tears as soon as she saw her grade. She claimed that it had been misgraded by the Scantron and insisted that it be rescored. She got the same score. I assumed that it was due to her anxiety, and I felt bad for her. That sympathy went away in an instant when, during class, she whispered to one of her friends that she'd always go to her mom's classroom instead of the library to take her tests. I always had a skill for eavesdropping since I was a relatively unassuming person who didn't say much in class. I didn't know what this meant for sure, but I assumed her mom, Karen, had looked up the answers for her. That explained immediately why she had gotten perfect scores on the previous test and why she had bombed this one. However, her blatant cheating didn't affect me one bit, so I turned a blind eye and kept doing my own thing. Then, the situation escalated a bit. See, her anxiety also allowed her some special privileges for taking standardized college placement exams, like the ACT and SAT. One of my friends had a sister who genuinely had a learning disability and absolutely needed the extra time. She was incredibly sweet. We'll call the sister Destiny. Destiny explained to me that when you present to the ACT testing facility with accommodations, you had two options. You could either take each of the 4 ACT sections 5 sections, if you took it with writing on separate days under normal time constraints, or take all of the sections on the same day with double the time on each section. Destiny also explained that all test takers with accommodations took the exam on the same day, different from normal test takers, so that they could ensure that each student's needs could be met. Destiny mentioned how Karen Jr. got a special room to take her tests in, not unlike her regular tests. That's all well and good, she thought. Except, when Destiny finished her exams, she noticed that Karen Jr. hadn't finished with the rest of the students. She assumed this meant that Karen Jr. had opted for the extended time option. Until, on Karen Jr.'s social media, she posted about how she was ready for day 2 of ACT testing. Sure enough, she had taken it over the course of several days. All of this meant that, somehow, Karen Jr. had taken the ACT with both accommodation options. I was never sure how this was possible, but in retrospect, it was probably her mom. Karen Jr. got a spectacular score on her exam, something like a 32 or 33. Again, this didn't particularly bother me. Her test scores didn't affect me one bit. I decided to take the information with a laugh and move on with my life. This is when things went from annoying to personal. You see, several students, including myself, were in the running to be our class's valedictorian. I didn't care too much, since the distinction wouldn't have gotten me any extra money from the college I was planning on attending. It was quite a shock to learn that Karen Jr., beyond a shadow of a doubt, was going to be our valedictorian for that year. To me, and many others, this seemed impossible. She hadn't taken nearly as many weighted classes as the lot of us, and was a good student at best. Also, Karen Jr.'s best friend was lined up to be salutatorian second in class rank. She was also a pretty mediocre student. So how did they both manage to get a higher GPA than us? We had been taking advanced placement courses since freshman year. The answer came to me as I was eating lunch one day. One of my friends, we'll call him Aaron, had been making up a calculus test in Karen's room. While he was there, he had overheard some seriously juicy information. Karen was looking at the student transcripts of high-ranking students, including myself, and had arranged for Karen Jr.'s schedule to inflate her GPA so much that it passed my own and the GPA of other hard-working students. This included taking some online classes from a local college, which I was never permitted to take. This is because the classes were so specific that the credits didn't transfer. We're talking about a college class about proper walking exercising technique here. Easy stuff. What's more concerning is that these student transcripts contained very sensitive information that included, but was not limited to, last 4 digits of Social Security, home addresses, phone numbers, medical history, approved medication, and academic records of all kinds. Why they'd openly whisper about this stuff with another student in the room was beyond me. I didn't want to take this information at face value, so I looked up the list of faculty that had permission to access student transcript information in the first place. Only a handful of teachers could do this. Wouldn't you believe that Karen's name was most certainly on the list? I also ran the numbers myself. It was totally possible to arrange a schedule of dumb classes that would exceed everyone else's GPA. The same had been done to Karen Jr.'s best friend's schedule, just not to the same extent. I was livid. That was my personal information, which, if leaked, could cause some serious privacy issues. Part of my Social Security number was on there, for goodness sake. So I decided that I wasn't going to take this lying down anymore. I looked up the regulations and codes regarding the sharing of a student transcript without consent, and wow, all of that stuff is under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And if you don't know anything about the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, just know that they don't mess around in the slightest. The state penalties alone for sharing student documents with a third party without consent, either from the parent if the student is under 18 or the student itself, was a hefty fine, possible termination, and further federal penalties. We're talking jail time if the information shared led to consequences for the student whose information was shared. All I needed was proof. Along with Aaron's testimony, I wanted irrevocable proof that Karen and Karen Jr. were doing shady stuff. So I hatched a plan. I was in the show choir, and so I had access to some decent recording equipment, including some single-use audio recorders. These were used by judges during competitions to give quick feedback on the show, and also for student auditions. They were small, discreet, and silent. They also had a neat feature where you could set a timer on the thing to tell it to start recording after so much time had passed. I set the timer so that the recorder would start during lunch. Before school one day, I went up to Karen's room to glance briefly and see if she was in there. She was not, and her room was not locked. Her classroom was on the second floor, so the stairwell door downstairs alone was locked at night. However, they unlocked these doors before school so that janitors could do spot cleaning before normal class hours. I taped one of these recorders under her chair, set the timer for around lunchtime and her planning period, they were back to back, and waited. I went back at the end of the day. I had choir practice and retrieved the recorder before the downstairs doors were locked. They left them unlocked for extracurricular activities because freshman and sophomore lockers were upstairs. I got home and began playing the tape. Bingo! I had my irrefutable evidence. It was all there. Conversations about Karen viewing student transcripts and disclosing that information to a third party, Karen Jr. Now, I have another problem. You see, Karen was extremely friendly with the administration, so I had to find someone who I knew would take me seriously and would cooperate while keeping my identity a secret. Fortunately, my counselor, we were each assigned one based on our last name, was a real stand-up guy, and I knew he'd come in clutch. I went with Aaron to his office, and I took my laptop with the audio file backed up onto it. We presented our case. You see, to file a Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act violation report, you needed the administration of the organization. This included my counselor to go on record saying that the complaint was legitimate and that further investigation was warranted. The complaint was also anonymous. He gave me his sweet approval on the form. I filed the complaint and waited. The fallout was glorious. The school's administration was forced to do an objective audit on all of Karen's activity at the school, where they confirmed that all of this nonsense had been taking place. Karen Jr.'s valedictorian status and her friend's salutatorian were sacked, and some other more deserving kid was presented with the honor. I was awarded salutatorian, although this didn't matter to me too much. The school was fined by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act for a breach of policy, and Karen got fired. I graduated before all of that took place. But it doesn't end there. During the audit, they also found evidence that Karen Jr. had been coming to her mom's room during regular tests and copying down answers from the internet, and she faced severe disciplinary action for that. That certainly wouldn't look good on her record. We're talking in school suspension due to multiple documented violations. The icing on the cake was when they discovered the mess regarding her ACT accommodations. Turns out, her mom had been pulling the strings behind the scenes to get her accommodations for that anxiety we talked about earlier. The ACT company takes cheating very seriously, and so they voided her pristine standardized testing score, which had landed her a full scholarship to her university of choice. The same ended up happening with some of her SAT and advanced placement scores as well for reasons that I never personally discovered. Karen Jr. lost all of her scholarship money from the university and ended up attending an in-state college that took the few scores that were not voided and also weren't fraudulent. Those scores probably weren't near as good as her voided ones. All of this news was absolutely buzzing around the school, and Karen Jr. was disgraced. I did my part in my graduation ceremony a few months later, and all was well. I never intended it to go so far, but I don't feel bad one bit. Revenge is sweet and best served by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Thanks for listening. Story 2. I am a 6'5" Staff Sergeant K-9 handler. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan and transferred to Homeland Security as a K-9 drug sniffer handler. I was doing my job and was on my way to a different terminal when I encountered a snotty brat. I saw him from the other side of the hallway that I was walking down. I saw him run over and yell, "Puppy." I put my hand out and said, "Please don't pet him, he's working." His mom came up from behind and said, "Why can't he pet your dog?" I replied, "Ma'am, he is not a domestic dog." He is a drug sniffer. He cannot be petted due to the rules. The snotty brat piped up and said, I want to pet it. Karen said, You can't, sweetheart, and he reached out to pet him. I yelled no and grabbed the kid's wrist. Not too hard, but enough to keep him from petting the dog. And his mom yelled, Assault. Security came running and the officer asked, What's going on? I explained that I told the mom and the child that they couldn't pet the K9, and both of them were taken by security. I was later told that they threatened to sue after they missed their flight. Dumb Karen. She got scolded hard and sent on her way. I feel like a jerk for grabbing his wrist, but that's what our training teaches us to do.